So Trump had his State of the Union, and I thought it went fantastic. I thought it was one of the best speeches that he's given as president, and it accomplished everything that I wanted him to do when it set out. There's a couple low points, which I'll get to, but I want to talk about what I expected from it, what it delivered, and what I thought the most important parts were. So what I wanted to see from the State of the Union was Trump to make a concerted effort to get people in the middle. He has a strong base, and they're basically going to back him as long as he doesn't do anything crazy, like totally give up on the wall or anything like that, which certainly this speech didn't do that. He was forceful enough, I think, to not lose anyone in his base. But when he's talking about the wall and the economy and things like that, he needs to go after these groups that he doesn't have a lot of support with right now. And so that would be groups like women, groups like minority groups, and I think he did a very good job. For example, one of the things he talked about, which I wish he would have spent more time on, and I always wish he would talk more about, is the great effect that legal immigration has on the country. And he did mention that, and I thought that was a very smart thing to do, to juxtapose that with the idea of illegal immigration, because people are always trying to conflate, if you're against illegal immigration, then you must be racist and you're against legal immigrants. Well, that's personally not how I feel at all. I've done several videos talking about why I think some of the best Americans I know are legal immigrants, and I don't feel that's how Trump feels. So it's nice to see him come out and talk about that specifically. And when he's talking about illegal immigration, he's talking about how it hurts minority communities. One of the best parts in the speech was when he talked about how it's the wealthy political class that's for things like open borders while they live behind gated communities. That's absolutely right. You've heard me and a lot of other people say that, but it's nice to hear Trump finally say that. So I thought he did a good job of trying to be conciliatory and uniting while at the same time backing up his base and really focusing on those middle groups. And I ended up thinking that was the best part, that he accomplished those goals fantastically. That's what I outlined before the speech on several social media sites, and I think he accomplished that. Not only that, I thought the fact that you have to understand, like, let me talk about a couple things I don't like about the State of the Unions in general. I don't like the pomp and circumstance necessarily in the standing up and the sitting down. And it's not that I don't like this, but you have to remember, this speech was written by other people. So it's always, I think you always learn more about someone from their reaction to something like this or when they're speaking off the cuff. And so, yeah, it's a great speech. It really is. But I could see people on the other side that want to be like, yeah, it's easy for Trump in front of the teleprompter to give a good speech. But what about his actions? What about what he does on his own or like on his Twitter feed? Yeah, that's definitely a fair criticism. In fact, I said the same thing about Obama. He sounded really good behind a teleprompter, but oftentimes when he wasn't behind a pre-written speech, he, fumbled around a little more. So anyways, I thought it was a really good speech for those reasons. Some of the down parts, like there's just two or three to hit. The one is, I don't think he should have brought up anything about the Mueller investigation or where he said like, oh, we need a strong economy and not to investigate me. It's just awkward and it puts people in a weird position. And I wish Trump would be quiet about the investigation in general. Let his people go out and speak. I do think it's a witch hunt. I do think it's horribly corrupt, but he ends up, when he says things like this, it makes it sound like, oh, he's trying to squirm out. He must be guilty of something. So I didn't like that. At first, when he said about the North Korea, that without him, there'd be a war, I think there's truth to the idea of everyone, particularly the Democrats, were very against the idea of him talking to the North Korean leadership. And so there's a good chance if that was their attitude that we would have had escalated tensions with North Korea. But there was no proof that there would have been a war. And oftentimes presidents do this in State of the Unions or these type of speeches where there's kind of two ways they could go about it. They could say, like, look at all the good I've done, or look at how terrible things would have been had I not been here. And I think that sometimes presidents, Obama did this, Bush did this, and Trump did it in this example where he falls into that trap. Instead of just saying, I did really good with North Korea, he says, oh, and if I wasn't here, really bad things would have happened. I would have rather he just kept it phrased towards the first rather than towards the second. The only other thing I have to criticize is on the content of the speech. I'm not so sure about this idea of ending the nuclear treaty. It's an issue I need to look more into, but I'm definitely not a fan of a new nuclear arms race. Now, if Russia's breaking the treaty, which seems like it's probably the case, then yeah, maybe we do need to revamp the treaty. And I do, like he said, maybe we'll enter into a new multilateral arms reduction treaty. But let's not act like the U.S. hasn't violated terms of nuclear reduction treaties in the past as well. So it's a two-way street, and we have to be honest about that. Now, what were the high points of this speech? So there are several. The first is, for me personally, I love the fact, and I wish he'd have talked a little more on it, but he talked about how we need to pull out of these never-ending wars, particularly in the Middle East and places like Afghanistan and Syria. He is absolutely right. And I know this is something that a lot of his Republican colleagues are pushing against. This is what I talk about when Trump was the idea of a potential he's a potential outsider, and he's going to rock the boat. If you've listened to my channel, you know my theory is that the establishment Republicans and Democrats are basically the same party when it comes to the big ideas, such as bailing out banks, Federal Reserve policy, foreign regime change wars, etc. And so you see this pushback from his party that's like, no, we need to stay in these wars, we need to stay. So good for Trump to take it right to the American people to say, we've been there 19 years. It's been almost 2 decades. It's time. And the way he phrased it, I thought was very clever, where he didn't make it seem like the military wasn't to be celebrated. He said, because of their hard work, because of the great service, that gives us an option to have a political solution. And he's absolutely right. That is the way we should be looking at things. And I thought that was a fantastic part of this speech. I really enjoyed it. The second I already talked about, I thought particularly on the economy and on the wall, he did a very good job of articulating why his policies would be good and have been good for like women, minority groups, etc. That's very important because the story that's pushed from the mainstream media constantly is he hates women, he hates minority groups, he hates anyone who's brown, etc. Everything he does is racist, but that's not true. Like one of the questions I asked a friend of mine that I had on my channel is, even if Trump is racist, don't get me wrong, that's a terrible thing. And if proof came out that like he really hates people of a certain color or something, I think that would be damning and that should be something that we hold accountable. But even if he is, what would you rather have? Like a president that secretly harbors these feelings, but the actions he's taking are actually helping minority communities? Or one that comes out and says, no, I love minority communities and everyone celebrates them as a hero, but then the status of the economy of people that are minorities and things like that ends up going down. So if Trump's a racist, he's a very poor racist because his policies are actually helping minority communities, women, and groups like that. Or if he's, you know what I mean. So I thought that was a very good part of his speech. I thought the best part, and personally, that I loved was his outright stance against how the United States will not be a socialist country. Now imagine 10 years ago that a president would have to say this at the State of the Union. It would have been unthinkable. We were told all the time, like, whoa, what about this policy? It might lead to socialism. And the Democrats were like, no, they're not social. We're not socialist. Are you kidding? No, we just think this social welfare program would be good. And although I'm leaning more towards fiscally conservative and not wanting a lot of these policies to be as big as they are, you can at least respect that idea. And we're like, yeah, sure, it's possible to have social, like, welfare programs or safety net programs that aren't full-blown socialism. But we are hearing more and more, getting closer and closer to that from people like Bernie, Ocasio-Cortez, and others that are pushing more to that extreme of socialism. Now, I'm going to do a video on one of the things I like about Cortez and Bernie is I still think that they care about constituents, which to me is an a priori issue over a lot of people in Washington that I think just literally are only there for their own personal power and don't care about constituents. So, but I do think that this mindset of socialism that people like Bernie and Cortez are pushing is very dangerous. And I did a whole 4-hour live stream on why I think that's the case. The problem with socialism. So it was nice to see Trump say that, and it was good to see the reaction of the Democrats. They kind of booed and hissed that, didn't they? But so that's extraordinary to me. But I'm glad that Trump came out and said that because it is an issue that's affecting our country right now. However, the number one most important, best thing from this speech actually had very little to do to Trump. Oh, one thing I'll say real quick before I get to that is I thought that Trump not only did a good job with his pre-written speech, but he did a good job riffing. For example, when they sang Happy Birthday, he's like, yeah, they wouldn't have sang that to me, and everyone kind of laughs. And, you know, other things like that. He did a very good job of just off the cuff being like conciliatory, unitary, and a message of unity, and also kind of being funny. And that's important because the media puts Trump like he's this monster. And it's not the case. You might not like him. You might think he's a buffoon. But the demonization that he gets from the media is extraordinary. And it further shows that they're just mouthpieces from the Democratic Party. That's all they are. So, now, the biggest, most important thing is, it was not anything Trump said. It was the reactions by the Democratic Party to things he said. That, to me, is what's the most telling. As I said, Trump's speech is pre-written. So you can only look at it so much like, yeah, okay, it's a flowery speech. It sounds good. Now let's see actions. Let's see how your Twitter feed looks afterwards. But the real reactions are the people that are hearing the speech from the first time and how they react. That's not pre-written. That's them actually reacting in the moment. And I think you could glean a lot from that. I was gobsmacked at some of the things that the Democrats refused to stand up for. Now, as I said at the outset, I find the pomp and circumstance to kind of be over the top and ridiculous. If you were to just sit there throughout the whole speech and maybe just clap, I wouldn't even mention it. I would say, hey, so what? They don't want to stand up for this guy they don't really like. That's fine. But once you start standing up and applauding for certain things, it makes it really evident what you're not standing up or not applauding for. And that, to me, is the issue. So had they just sat in their hands the whole time, I wouldn't have an issue with it. I would just say, and people would have been saying, oh, the Democrats refuse to applaud for this. And I mean, granted, they could have applauded for, the survivors and things like that. That, of course, you stand and applaud for that. But everything else that Trump's saying, had they just sat in their hands, I swear I would have been like, look, it's not that they don't like these things, it's that they don't like Trump, so they're not going to applaud for anything he says is his accomplishment. But as it is, they stand for something. So then you have to say, okay, well then clearly they're willing to stand and applaud for some things that Trump's talking about, so let's take a look at what they didn't stand for. They didn't stand for calls to unity from the beginning. They didn't stand for calls for compromise at the beginning. They didn't stand or applaud for things like black unemployment rate. They actually, it zoomed in on Cortez. Many of them didn't stand and applaud when they talked about ICE doing great work in arresting sex traffickers. So they hate ICE so much that they're actually not even going to applaud when they're arresting sex traffickers? It's absolutely mind-boggling. And again, with minority unemployment, they didn't stand for that? Isn't that a big deal? It's almost as if, Bill Maher said, they want an economic decline so they could get power. That just seems insane. Now, again, I can't recall specifically. I'm sure the Republicans have done this in the inverse when Obama was president. But I can't recall an incident where Obama was like, the economy is doing much better, unemployment for blacks or minorities is doing bad. And the Republicans were like, we're not going to applaud for that. I don't know. Maybe it's happened. I can't definitively say. But I do know in this speech, that was very telling. But the most telling thing, that I think it's hilarious because the media is talking about this as a big victory for the Democrats, was basically what I have pictured right here. What this moment captures is Nancy Pelosi kind of chiding the president after he talks about how great his economy's been for women, and he kind of riffs and he's like, don't sit down yet because, here's something you're really going to love, about how many women are now in office. And the women go nuts in the Democratic Party. All these women wearing whites. They're high-fiving each other. They're dancing. They're kind of chanting something that you couldn't really hear. But they're chiding the president while they're doing this. I thought it was a big moment of the president to say that. They're like, the media's like, oh, it was like president didn't realize that most of them were Democrats. Of course he realized that. He's saying, I don't care. It's still a good step for women. This is how I felt like when Obama got elected. It was like, I would never vote for someone based on their skin color, and I think the identity politics is overwhelmingly stupid and dangerous. However, if I was black, I would, even if I didn't like Obama and his policies and I voted Republican, still when he won, it can't help but be emotional for you. This is a big barrier that was broken. And even Republicans could appreciate that. I feel the same way here, where you have all these women that were elected. It's like, I don't think we should elect people just because of their gender, but the fact that so many women want, that's something that could be applauded. Now, I think that there's a danger of this, and we get too much into this, woe is women, they're always the victims things, when oftentimes that's not the case. But nonetheless, so what? The women celebrate. Isn't it, the fact that this is then seen as a victory of them against Trump is totally ridiculous. And it comes off as incredibly selfish to me. That they couldn't stand for minority unemployment. They couldn't stand for ICE arresting sex traffickers. They couldn't stand for unity. But man, when it was stand for them as individuals, woo, we're great. Yeah, high five. Woo, we're chanting. It just goes to show this is exactly what Trump was talking about when he's talking about the wall, and he's talking about what's good for the political class versus what's good for the average people. They can stand up and celebrate themselves. It's just like the Washington Post. They celebrate themselves in a Super Bowl ad. It's very telling. These people are so arrogant. They think they're so great. I mean, look at Pelosi there. The president just said something that, is conciliatory and unitary. That's like, look, it's great that women took this. And they couldn't just be like, thank you. That was gracious of the president to say that. They have to be like, yeah, how about that? We stuck it in your eye, didn't we, Trump? And it just shows the childish nature. Especially when you juxtapose that with, not standing for the ICE officers arresting sex traffickers, not standing for unity and saying that we need to come together and compromise, not standing for black or minority unemployment rates and jobs for minorities being so great. All of that pales in comparison to these Democrats, as opposed to celebrating themselves. That's important. What's more important for women? The fact that 54% of the jobs that have been created under Trump have gone to women? The fact that they now are dominating when it comes to universities and things like that. But, things that, I guess Trump didn't really talk about that in his speech. But he's talking about how his economy is good for women. That's great if you're someone who is focused on women issue. But what's more important, that or these individual women being elected? Clearly, the economy argument's better. But they didn't have anything to say to that. They didn't really, the celebration for that wasn't that great. And it just goes to show this selfish nature, that they only care about themselves and issues that affect themselves. They want to be celebrated as these heroes. They act like they overcame some great, obstacle or barrier. But what did these individuals, they're still pretty much the women that have been elected. That's not the average woman. And this is something I always talk about with identity politics, where it's like, well, men have all these advantages. Oh, in what sense? Well, look at, Fortune 500 companies, how many CEOs are men? Yeah, that's great, and that might be true, and it's worth talking about, but that's not the average man. Like, those corporate bosses have more in common, or have less in common with, the average man than women have with the average man. So when you talk about those people being privileged and it's all men, yeah, but it's unfair then to malign like, oh, and the guy that's working on sewers, he's privileged because people of the same gender as him happen to be CEOs more often. And so we don't look at the majority and the vast grouping of the people if we're looking at it in specific groups. Instead, we just look at the top tier. Well, the top tier of women don't seem to be doing as impressively as the top tier of men. Okay, but let's not focus on the top tier, particularly in a speech like this. Let's focus on, like, average man and average woman. And we're talking about how, things are getting better for the average women when it comes to the economy. But that's less important than, we at the top tier, we're doing great. High five. Woo! Take that, Trump. Look how great we're doing. I mean, to me, it was just damning. And it's funny to me that the media is spinning this as like, oh, this was some poignant victory for women over Trump. No, it wasn't. He was gracious. He knew that most of them were in the opposing party, and he didn't care. He still said it was a good thing. Hardly seems like someone who's a sexist misogynist that wants to keep women in Handmaiden Tales outfits, does it? So that was my feeling on the State of the Union. Real quick, the rebuttal I saw from Stacey Abrams. I didn't see the Bernie one yet, but I might do a separate video on it. I thought it was okay. It seemed pre-canned. Those things are really difficult to do. She did a better job than the Democrats did last year, and a better job than like Rubio did when Obama was giving the State of the Union. So, but one thing I will say, and I might do a whole video on this, is remember, it was always the Republicans' message of the country is dark. Trump's so dark. His messages are so dark. Watch Trump's speech, the State of the Union, versus Abrams' speech. You tell me which one's more dark. You tell me which one's more foreboding and which one's optimistic. I think it's clear that Trump's was better. And all the poll numbers coming out saying that people thought Trump did a fantastic job, despite the media trying to push it as, oh, he didn't do good, he did terrible. So, yeah, thanks for listening. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Hit the alert button, the little bell there, so you can get updates on when I update videos. I'm trying to put up videos daily, so look for that. And I'll be doing a live stream on Friday at noon. So thanks, everyone, and have a good one.